Matthew couldn't remember how long it had been since he last visited his hometown. It had been years since he left that remote and impoverished place in a fit of anger with his parents, never to return. Working in a small city far from home, his life was immeasurably better than what it had been in his poor household. But in recent days, Matthew didn't know what was wrong. He constantly felt a nagging sense of unease. Moreover, he dreamt of his elderly mother with her white hair, calling out to him with tear-stained eyes in his dreams. Over the days, Matthew couldn't bear it any longer. Every time he saw his mother's red eyes in his dreams, his heart ached intensely. Packing his bag and traveling by various means of transport, he finally reached the boundaries of his hometown. There were still about 15 miles of narrow, winding paths ahead, which were completely inaccessible by car. Having eaten and drunk his fill in the town, and buying some tasty treats for his mother, Matthew hurriedly set off for home. Having grown up here, he knew the road like the back of his hand. As he was walking and felt like he was close to home, a small forest suddenly appeared before him. In Matthew's memory, there was no forest along this road. He thought it might be possible that these trees were planted after he had been away for so long. The forest had a leaf-covered path, and to Matthew's surprise, he didn't recognize any of the trees growing in the dense woods. Everything was red, the tree trunks were red, the leaves were red, everything was a bright, scarlet red. Walking on the red leaves, Matthew felt an increasingly unsettling feeling. What kind of trees were these? They looked so eerie. Without any further thought and seeing that it was getting late, he hurried on his way home. As he was walking, suddenly a thick droplet fell onto his neck. Reaching up to touch it, Matthew was startled. He had touched something fresh red, smelling of blood, just like blood. Looking up, Matthew was scared witless and ran as if his life depended on it. He saw many blood-soaked heads hanging from the trees, swinging in the wind as if they were fruits growing on the trees, numerous and densely packed. As he ran, Matthew looked around and saw that every tree was filled with hanging heads, shaking chaotically on the branches. Matthew's heart was pounding fiercely, and he felt as if his breathing was about to stop. He ran forward with his eyes closed and gasping for air. As he ran, he felt a pair of invisible hands push him hard from behind, and Matthew stumbled forward. A piercing pain shot through Matthew's palms, and opening his eyes, he saw both his hands were cut by the sharp stones on the ground, and blood was flowing out. Something was wrong. Matthew looked up in shock to see that the red forest filled with hanging heads had disappeared, and the familiar path was before him once again. Regardless, the horrifying forest was gone, and with his nerves still shaken, Matthew hurriedly continued towards his home. Soon, he arrived at the small bridge at the entrance of the village, and Matthew's mood relaxed a lot because after crossing this bridge and turning right, his family's village was not far away. Looking at the flowing water under the bridge, Matthew remembered how he used to play here as a child, always getting scolded by his mother for getting his clothes dirty. Remembering these moments, Matthew couldn't help but smile happily, truly missing his mother who would always scold him fiercely. Matthew was momentarily surprised before recognizing the child as Tommy, his neighbor's kid. Before Matthew could speak, Tommy said, "Brother Matthew, you're back. Come and take a bath with me in the water first." Matthew smiled, "I'm back, to visit my old mother. You play by yourself first, I'll come to join you after I've seen my mother." While saying this, Matthew crossed the small bridge and, turning a corner, saw the familiar rows of adobe houses. Nothing had changed, it was all the same. Matthew couldn't help but feel emotional and quickened his pace towards home. The village was eerily quiet, as if unnaturally so, lacking even the usual hustle and bustle of chickens and dogs. Something is wrong. The village is usually the noisiest place, why is it so quiet now? The excitement of being nearly home instantly faded, and Matthew unconsciously slowed down. No one was to be seen when he arrived at his house, making the silence eerily unsettling. Matthew noticed not only the absence of people but also that something was seriously wrong with every household's house. It seemed as though the houses had been long abandoned, with walls crumbling and doors and windows broken. The roofs of every house were overrun with weeds as tall as a person, presenting a scene of utter desolation and neglect. Sensing something was terribly wrong, Matthew dashed towards his family's 3 thatched houses. The scene was the same, no sign of life and utter disrepair, even the house's front door had fallen off and lay askew. Matthew felt an urge to cry, considering the possibility that the entire village had collectively left the place. It seemed his family had completely abandoned him as well. But something didn't add up. He had just seen Tommy at the pond, which meant the people of the village hadn't left. Matthew rushed into the dilapidated house, where thick dust covered everything, seemingly untouched from when he left, all remarkably unchanged. Walking into the inner room with bewilderment, Matthew was stunned when he opened the door. Lying side by side on a large khan, a traditional Chinese heated bed, were 3 bodies, or rather, 3 headless bodies. Thick quilts covered them, with their necks sticking out awkwardly above the quilts. The pillows were coated with a thick layer of what seemed to be dried, black blood. With a howl, Matthew pulled off the quilts from the 3 bodies and recognized them. These dried, blackened, headless corpses were his parents and his only younger brother. After a moment of wailing and noticing the approaching darkness outside, Matthew dried his tears and stepped outside. He remembered Tommy at the pond and decided to ask Tommy what exactly had happened here after he had left. When Matthew ran to the pond, he searched around but couldn't find Tommy, who had been bathing in the water. Reluctantly, Matthew went back to the village, searching every house. The results were baffling. The entire village had died in their homes, all in the same way, they were all missing their heads. What frightened Matthew the most was that he saw Tommy's body in his neighbor's house. After such a tumult, the day turned to night. Matthew sat in his yard, holding his aching, distressed head in his hands, under the gentle glow of the moon. Matthew looked at the village shrouded in darkness, puzzled about how everyone in the village had died, all without their heads. Where had so many heads gone? Heads. Heads. Matthew slapped his thigh, remembering that on the way back, in the red forest that had later disappeared, weren't many human heads hanging from the trees. With this thought, Matthew grit his teeth, finding a few hatchets used for chopping wood, and by the light of the moon, briskly walked out of the village. Matthew had only one belief, that even if he died, he needed to understand exactly what had occurred. He wanted to seek justice for his villagers and his family. As Matthew was seeking the red forest full of heads, the previously clear night sky disappeared. The moon had also mysteriously vanished. The sky turned gloomy, and the cold wind blew relentlessly. Matthew felt a chill run down his spine and involuntarily tightened his clothes around him. The wind grew stronger, and in the darkness, Matthew held the hatchet tightly in his hand, his red eyes shouting loudly, "Come out! I want to see what kind of demon you are, daring to commit such atrocities. Even if I die today, I'll take you down with me." The wind, with its haunting howls, circled eerily in Matthew's ears, mournful and lingering, heart-wrenchingly sad. Matthew could feel his face becoming numb from the biting cold. Suddenly, dots of serene light appeared before Matthew's eyes, shimmering in the darkness, just like stars in the night sky. Upon looking carefully, Matthew recognized the red forest full of heads. The serene lights were the eyes of the heads hanging from the trees, casting a gentle glow. Matthew realized that these heads were the villagers, their eyes illuminating the night sky, guiding him to this strange red forest. Matthew no longer felt fearful. He brandished the hatchet in his hand and slashed at a tree trunk. The tree bore a deep cut, and fresh red blood flowed out. Indeed, this is a devil forest. Matthew struck a few more times at the tree trunk, each strike drawing blood. But Matthew also noticed that the heads hanging from the trees seemed to be frowning, in clear pain. Could they all be attached? Matthew sheathed his hatchet and looked carefully at the heads hanging from the trees. Suddenly, Matthew saw a face he recognized all too well. Despite the weak light, he certainly wouldn't misidentify his mother's face. Abruptly, Matthew tore off his coat and lit it on fire with a branch in hand. With the light from the flame, Matthew saw clearly that it indeed was his mother hanging from the tree. Looking at his mother, who hung from the tree with her face devoid of color, Matthew dropped to his knees in devastation, and he called out to his mother in agony. His cries echoed, deepening his feeling of helplessness. Tears misting his eyes, Matthew looked up and gritted his teeth. "Mother. Can you tell me what to do now?" Her eyes were dripping with her tears, blinking constantly at Matthew, seemingly trying to tell him something. Matthew steadily held his mother's gaze, gradually understanding that her eyes were fixed on the torch in his hand and then glancing back at him. Matthew gave a firm nod, bowed to his mother with 3 solemn kowtows, and walked resolutely to the middle of the red forest. Raising the torch, Matthew set the entire red forest ablaze. In the crackling sounds of the fire, coupled with the foul stench of burning flesh, the heads hanging from the trees began to fall. Too many of them, hundreds of villagers' heads, Matthew couldn't pick them all up, and he watched helplessly as they burned in the fire. The fire continued to burn until the next morning when it finally began to die down, leaving only the charred ruins. It was at this point Matthew realized that this so-called red forest full of hanging heads was their village. Nothing was left, nothing at all. His family, the villagers, the village, all had become scorched earth. As Matthew turned to leave his nightmare-infested hometown, he saw hundreds of people suddenly appear before him. "You're all alive!" Matthew exclaimed excitedly. But when he reached out to embrace his old mother, his arms met only air. "My child, we are all ghosts, here to say goodbye," his mother said tenderly, looking at Matthew, who had matured so much over the years. 3 years ago, a red tree sprouted from beneath our village. Everyone found it strange, so we cherishingly nurtured it, treating it like a treasure. The red tree grew rapidly. In just a few days, it became a towering tree. No one expected it to be an evil entity that needed the blood of our entire village to nourish itself. One night, everyone woke to find their heads separated from their bodies, hanging from the tree. And not just that, the red tree trapped our souls on it, unable to be freed. Only you could be the one to save everyone. So we hoped day and night for your return, to rescue us from this demon. Do you remember Tommy in the water when you entered the village? That was the demon, afraid that you would destroy it, disguising itself as Tommy, attempting to kill you.